you are being given quite the award. Can you tell me a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I mean, the award is awarded by the Lieutenant Governor to folk who have actively, in some way, supported interfaith engagement, some kind of dialogue, some kind of conversations, those sort of things, to build up a sense of who we are as Canadians, as people. I felt a little awkward because I know that there are people who have been working in this field for a long time who really have, they're the ones who've done the heavy lifting, who've done all that. But I was fortunate to be in the Central Park community at a time when it was everything was opening up, and it was a very interfaith, interreligious, intercultural community. So I feel kind of oddly like a bad case of imposter syndrome, except that I think they do. Anyway, so I feel like I'm receiving it on behalf of a community which is, by its heart and soul, interfaith, intercultural, all of those things.
Yeah. Can you tell me a little bit more about, what it's like to be someone living in the Central Park neighborhood?
Well, Central Park is always a transitional neighborhood. It's historically been a neighborhood of first arrival as people first come. So it does change as people arrive. And I've now been out of that neighborhood for close to four years. So I'm reluctant to speak too much. But at the time when we first started there, which I guess is like 18 years ago or something now, it was many West Africans, many Somalis, folk like that, primarily a refugee community. At that point, Welcome Place was right in the neighborhood, and the housing component was right beside Knox. So it was a highly diverse neighborhood, right off the bat. It changes over the years as folk kind of migrate out and other folk come in. But it retains that essential quality that, we also often joke that kids in the Sister Max school, if there were 30 kids in the classroom, Sister Max, the school, public school in the neighborhood, and if there were 30 kids in the classroom, there was 28 countries of origin, and it really was that. It's atypical that way because often you have large population groups. You might have a large Somali group moving into a traditionally Chinese neighborhood or so forth, but in Central Park, it was really just everyone was from somewhere.
So Lynn, before you retired, what did an average Sunday look like?
Well, the church itself had moved from being about, when I arrived, it was about 85%, 75 to 85%, 75 to 85% Euro-Canadian, mostly old. They told me that the average age there was 65, but the way they figured out average was obviously quite different than I would have done. It was an older congregation, so many older folk. And there was a remnant of the historical Japanese congregation as well. So the diversity was primarily from that. And then over the 14 years that I was there, it had transformed into about 85% newcomer, racialized, non-white, non-European, folk who do not have the traditional Canadian United Church background. Okay. So it was an utter transformation that way. But it also morphed in a way that there were many people who were Muslim who would say that Knox was their church. And what that meant was that really the concept of Knox was broader than the Christian worshiping community that was housed there. So the market was a part of it, the kitchen was a part of it, all those things went into being a part of it, which at times was difficult for especially folk, I think, in the broader church to sometimes kind of understand what that was all about. That the people who were not participants in the Christian worshiping community really were part of the Knox ministry and mission and life. It wasn't that they were being served; they were part of it. So I think so much of what I experienced and learned in terms of interfaith, intercultural engagement, I was taught by the people who lived there, just by their living, their being, you know.
Yeah, totally. Completely understand that. So, you retired, I guess, 4 years ago it was now. Uh,
Yeah.
what have you been up to since then?
Well, retired to do. I got a research grant to do something in the area. I thought it was going to be a book or workbooks in the area of sort of the pragmatics of intercultural ministry, using well, a mixture, but it was a research project using primarily qualitative research. But then as we went along, and as I was had developed this sort of curriculum, the church said, you know what? Nah, maybe not a book. You know, nobody reads books anymore. And those workbooks, they don't really work very good. Podcast, Bill, podcast. We think you
Mm.
should do podcasts. So I said, that's great, having never listened at that point to a podcast in my life. But anyways, what happened was that it ended up as a series of, well, it's supposed to be 26. It's 24 right now. There's one left to publish and one more to do. I have a terrible time finishing things, it seems. It's a podcast series called Open Out.
Okay.
And it really is on the practical dimension of intentionally opening yourself as a person, as a community. Yeah, so that, and then I've also been doing some contract work in churches. I'm working a little bit in Niverville. I'm working a little bit at Broadway Disciples, which is a largely Filipino congregation.
Okay. Well, what was it like putting that podcast together? It sounds very interesting.
Uh, you can see there would be inherent problems with that. It's an auditory form, and you just heard me stumbling and stuttering and with long pauses and all that. So I'm not exactly smooth talking. And it was actually, I was really helped by Terry McLeod, who is a friend and former CBC host, and who really actually sat in the beginning just to help me control my tonality. I've been a preacher for like 40 years. And so I had a tendency to sit in the room and preach to myself. And it was like, in fact, the first one was so annoying. I actually got angry listening to myself. It was so irritating. So it took a while to kind of get into that. But I wanted to look at some really practical stuff. Implicit bias. How does bias work? Where does, and to avoid blaming. We have a tendency, especially liberal progressives, evangelicals, they got their own stuff too, but they have a tendency to move quickly to blaming, to saying this group or that perspective is bad because of something. More often, it's because our brains are not built necessarily to be open to diversity in the same way. So we have to help our brains out. So it really is, amongst other things, it's about doing that. Also reflects a bias of mine that the future for many churches, the one I can speak of with some confidence is the United Church. I believe that it lies in, not in the mainstream, but in the outcast, in the newcomer communities, in those who have not yet found a place, in Indigenous communities, that's where there's a kind of a vitality and a life that is really helpful to my own particular denomination. And so I think, so one of the challenges I think is simply doing that, of opening out. That term was actually coined. I did a 3-month contract in Canmore, and the people there coined that term of opening outwards, opening out. But it kind of fits. So that was a kind of a major piece of it. The podcast, it was weird. A little bit weird also because it's like during COVID, it's like, I felt like I would sit in my room and do these things. It was kind of odd. Probably like, where are you right now? Are you at your home? At your home?
No, I'm in our
You're
studio.
in the
So
studio. Okay. See,
yeah.
you get out of bed.
Yep. I'm not walking from one room to the other to talk
Yeah,
to a
yeah.
wall.
Yeah, that was, you know,
Yeah,
a little bit of it.
definitely.
Yeah.
Well, what would you say to other people who are thinking about getting into interfaith work or at the very least working with multiple cultures at once?
I don't know. I can only really reflect on my own experience. Before I went to Knox, 2 years before, I started having a series of dreams. And in those dreams, I found myself somehow connecting with the Muslim community. At that point, if I'd even met a Muslim, I'm not very many. So I had these dreams, and these dreams were so exquisitely beautiful that I actually would wake up crying. And then I thought, well, you know what? Maybe this is the work for me, is to be involved in interfaith stuff in some way. So I applied for, there's not a lot of jobs there, but I applied around, so nothing. And then a couple of years later, Knox came along, and I thought, well, I guess that was just sort of a weird series of dreams. And it wasn't until a couple of years into that the link between those dreams and that reality started to come forward. And that was in large part because of the Somali community. And there we found some interesting commonalities, because the Somalis, my background is Irish, and the Somalis are called the Irish of Africa, and their expression of Islam is traditionally Sufi, so it's mystic, it's the mystic branch. And of course, Irish Christianity is the mystic branch. They're also stubborn like Irish people and all the other things, but there's a whole bunch of ways in which there's similarity and commonality. And then things began to happen in response to 9/11. We had a church and mosque picnic. So things just began to unfold. The key thing was simply opening to the people who were around you. So being either interfaith or intercultural, none of those were goals in themselves. It was simply, we have these buildings and they are vital, they can be vital community hubs. So what would it be like simply to open them and welcome the community, not with some sort of sense of that we are the controllers of the space, but just that we, I guess a church word would be stewards. We're the caretakers. And we offer this space, which is God's space, which is sacred space, which is community space, to be used by the community in whatever the way they want. And simply to believe in that as a possibility. When we did that, everything changed. So I think I wouldn't want to be speaking to anybody, well, maybe it would fit their experience, but to have a goal of being interfaith or anything. But what's right outside your door? Who are the people who are around you? And if the people who are around you frighten you, if you go to Superstore and you're standing in line and people ahead of you are speaking one language, the people behind you a different language, well, then you're probably at the Superstore and Sergeant. But the other reality is, if that frightens you, then you've got something going on inside you. So what is that? What's going on? I find that when I'm in that space, I think, oh, isn't it wonderful? Isn't it great to be in this country? Isn't it wonderful that people can be here and find commonality? So I think it's about believing in the deep humanity of everyone. And that deep humanity is, I guess, the soul. It's what I believe faith is all about. There are differences between religions. For instance, Buddhism, I keep thinking eventually I'm going to come across something in Buddhism that I disagree with. I'm sure I will, I just haven't yet. And all of us, all of us are selective in how we use text. People talk about the Quran. Well, you know what? In the church, there's not a lot of people who talk about our violent stuff in there. We hush up on that. That's a part of the evolutionary history of civilizations. So we don't spend, well, maybe some people do, but we don't go actively, trying to stone people. And so what I think is inside all of us is this quest. And the only way that we have to describe language, to speak about faith, is metaphor. because this takes us, it's the assurance of things that cannot be seen. When it's beyond comprehension, when you try to explain, all that we have is metaphor. So then to say to somebody else, well, you know what? Your metaphor like really sucks. My metaphor is a really good metaphor, but your metaphor, like, it's a really bad metaphor. I mean, it's kind of is silly. So, when Christians pray and they pray God and they say, oh, God, well, it feels like we're using a name, but that's not God's name. It's like saying, woman, man. So that metaphor bit is just understanding and being a bit humble and saying, you know what, I believe really deeply, and it really deeply affects my life. That doesn't mean you're wrong. Let's just be open to the fact that your metaphor causes you to see it one way, mine causes to see it a different way. An example, a little bit for me, is the Christmas story. There are two traditions around Jesus. Jesus is born in a barn in Luke. It says, okay, you're born in a barn. But there was another tradition, comes out in the proto-gospel of James and some other places, that Jesus was born in a cave, not in a barn. Well, in the story of Jesus being born in the barn, God and Mary worked this out. Joseph is a pretty hapless figure. He just sort of, I'll divorce her. Oh, no, I'm not going to. Oh, okay. Well, he just goes along. So the male is kind of excluded there. Well, in the story of Jesus being born in a cave, Joseph goes out. He said, oh, man, she's going into labor. And he goes and spends the evening knocking on doors, trying to find a midwife. He finally finds one, gets back, and misses the whole blessed event. The Christ child has been born. Both of those are stories that have essentially the same truth. And so for us to get into a question about fact is to miss the truth. Facts are of some importance, but it's truth that really transforms us. And so I think it's the same way when we engage with people who have other stories. One of the key expressions in Sikh faith is truth is the highest virtue. Higher still is truthful living. Well, Jesus could have said that. It takes you into this kind of mystical world. So in all of these things, we become afraid when we become. I think Christians have a tendency, and probably lots of other people of other faiths, that if we actually engage in those conversations, if we open ourselves, perhaps, my faith is going to come crumbling down. But that surely hasn't been my experience. Mine has gotten deeper and stronger, more grounded in Christianity, the more I spend time with folk who are from a variety of faith perspectives, simply because I'm not afraid. So I think trying to rid ourselves, to let go of fear, can then help us to, there is no fear in love. It's the opposite of it. So in the same way, so if we can let that go, then I think we can have conversations, we can learn from one another, we can pray together, we can respect one another. And I suspect this is a much healthier way for us to live, and I suspect much more pleasing to God.